Welcome to Adventures in History. I'm your host Danny, and every week we uncover incredible true stories from the past, from spectacular inventions and daring explorers to world-changing ideas and unforgettable characters. We leave the dark chapters behind and we focus on the fun, surprising, and inspiring moments that everyone can enjoy. And whether you're listening alone or you've got kids in the background, well, there's always a new adventure to be discovered. So sit back, get curious, and let's travel back in time. Alright, here's a question for you. If I told you that Cinderella, Snow White, and Hansel and Gretel were all collected by just two brothers who claimed they got these tales from humble old peasant women gathered by candlelight in tiny cottages, would you believe that? Well, you shouldn't, because that's actually not true. And here's the part that's really gonna get you. One of those mysterious old peasant women they wrote about in their actual book wasn't old at all. I mean, she may or may not have lived across the street, and by the end of this episode, she's going to become a huge part of this story, so stick around for that. But first, we need to rewind and meet the two brothers who pulled this off. And along the way, there's a decision that they made together quietly in a small apartment that's going to change the entire trajectory of this story and their lives. Welcome to Adventures in History. Let's get into the first part of the story. Our story starts in Germany in the late 1700s in a small town called Hanau. Jacob Grimm was born in 1785 and his younger brother Wilhelm came along just the next year. Here's a fun fact, by the way. They had a lot of siblings. We're talking like a huge family. There were like 9 of them running around in a tiny little home in Germany. And there were no real sources about what the house really looked like, but I'm wondering how many bathrooms did they have in the house? I mean, it would have been a real challenge finding an open bathroom. Wouldn't you agree? Alright, so their dad had a solid job. I mean, he was a local magistrate, which is basically like a town judge. And the family was economically doing just fine. They had a nice home, they were well respected in the community, and Jacob and Wilhelm were on track for a pretty normal life. And a pretty normal future at that. I mean, they were going to go to a good school, probably university after that, probably studying law as their dad would have wanted. And everything was pretty much going according to plan until it didn't. Because in 1796, everything flipped and their situation turned pretty much to the worst. Their father got sick and passed away. He was only 44 years old. Jacob was just 11 years old at the time. And back then, there was really no safety net. I mean, you couldn't rely on the government or any type of state support. And so they had to basically fend for themselves. And the family at that time, I mean, they lost their main earner, the main person who provided for the family. And so almost overnight, the Grimms went from comfortable living to genuinely struggling. I mean, 11-year-old Jacob basically had to start acting like a man of the house, which I think you and I both agree that is a huge responsibility for an 11-year-old kid. Now, thankfully, they weren't totally on their own. They had an aunt and their grandfather who essentially stepped in to help out quite a bit. And their grandfather specifically had a very interesting philosophy, which we'll get to in a bit, but he stepped in to pay for their schooling. But their grandfather also sent along something else. He sent along a handful of pretty, almost angry, blunt letters, laying out exactly the entire future for the Grimm brothers and what he expected them to do and how they were going to live their life if they wanted basically any kind of future at all. Now, we're not going to get to what the letter said just yet, but I will tell you this. Whatever their grandfather wrote to them, those two boys took it completely to heart. I mean, they loved their grandfather, and he was, at that point, basically like a father figure. So they respected the man a lot. And whatever he said in those letters, it shaped literally everything that happened next. Let's head into part 2, and you'll see exactly what I mean. Alright, so picture 2 teenage brothers sharing one small room to save money. They're sharing a single bed to save on heating in the winter. They're studying something like 12 hours a day. I mean, those guys were on a mission. They were super studious. And while other kids were out having fun, these two were basically buried in books. barely coming up for air, which sounds really boring. I mean, these days I feel like they will be called nerds. But you know what? The two brothers were on a mission, and they had their head down, and they were going to achieve something. Now, remember that letter from their grandfather? Well, here's what it actually said, in plain terms. Since the boys had no money and no fancy family connections, the only real shot at a good life was to simply outwork everybody else around them. I mean, their grandfather was like the original motivational speaker, right? And they respected their grandfather a lot, which is why they took it so seriously, which is why they stuck to the plan, and they studied, and they read books. And it worked, because they graduated at the top of their very class, and they went off to university, just like expected, in a town called Marburg. And you guessed it, they studied law, just like their father would have wanted. So everything was going according to plan. But here's the catch. Marburg was full of wealthy, noble kids with huge allowances and a lot of money. And those kids were what we would call living it up, which meant Jacob and Wilhelm kind of stood out. I mean, they had the cheapest clothes. They would have been eating the cheapest meals to save money, and they had to practically beg for special permission just to get in the door. But there's a little silver lining here, because since they couldn't afford to go out and party with the rich kids, as we would call them, they just kind of stayed in and read a lot. And that turned out to be exactly the right move, because in Marburg, they meet a professor who changes absolutely everything. And this professor is a brilliant young law professor named Friedrich Karl von Savigny. And Savigny had a super interesting philosophy. I mean, he was a real intellectual, and he believed that if you really want to understand a country's laws, you first have to understand its history, its language, and its oldest folktales and traditions. And this is where we gotta give him credit, he actually saw the potential in the two brothers. I mean, he saw their intellectual curiosity. He saw how sharp they were and how hardworking they were. And he did something incredibly generous. He handed them free access to his own private library. And as you can imagine, an intellectual professor such as Savigny had a pretty remarkable library. And the library was stuffed with old manuscripts and rare books. And for the two students with almost no money, I mean, that was basically like hitting the jackpot. They were super excited. Now, at this point, Jacob heads off to Paris for a research project. And Wilhelm stays behind, alone. And he doesn't have his best friend, his brother, who he usually turns to share stories, to laugh with, right? To study with. And he does the next best thing. He quietly falls in love with something else. Old German poetry, which he finds tucked away in a tiny little corner in Savigny's private library. And he spends weeks studying it. I mean, he's dissecting every word, every sentence, every paragraph. And when Jacob finally comes back from Paris, he opens the door, he puts down his suitcase, and Wilhelm jumps at the opportunity to tell him exactly what he's been up to in the last few weeks. He tells him everything, and Jacob finally sees exactly what his brother's been reading. And the two of them sit down together and they make a decision. And they make a decision that's going to shape their entire future. And we're going to get to that in a second. But I will tell you this, it's the single choice that leads directly to everything else that falls in this episode. The fairy tales, the fame, all of it. Keep that in your back pocket. We're going to come back to it very soon. Let's head into part 3. Now, before we get into what these brothers decided, we need to set the scene a little bit, because this will explain why they made the choice they made at the time. See, this time Germany was not really a one single country. I mean, one Germany, one unified Germany didn't really exist. It was really like a huge land with a bunch of different states. And Napoleon's armies, Napoleon was a French general making his way through Europe. And Napoleon's armies had been marching through and basically pushing the French language and the French culture onto everybody. So a lot of the German thinkers started asking themselves a pretty big question. If we don't have one king, what are we as a people? And we don't have one set of borders. What actually makes us German? And a lot of people came up with the same answer. It's our language, it's our stories, it's our history. The old tales that families had been telling each other for generations, sitting around campfires, night after night, basically for hundreds of years. There was real excitement in the atmosphere building around collecting and protecting that old culture. And before it slipped away and basically disappeared for good. Now here's where it all connects. Remember that decision Jacob and Wilhelm made right after Jacob got back from Paris? Here it is. They decided to walk away from law completely. They said, forget that safe, respectable path that our father wanted us to be on, that their grandfather had sacrificed to set them up for. They wanted to spend their lives on old language and old stories instead. And it just so happened that one of their two best friends actually just published a collection of old German folk songs. Now, knowing how careful and thorough the Grimm's brothers were with research, their two friends said, hey, why don't you go collect some old folk tales for us? It was the perfect opportunity, landing at the exact right moment in their lives. And here's an important detail. Jacob and Wilhelm did not set out to write a children's book, not even close. They were serious scholars. That's not to be understated. I mean, they were academics, right? They had studied real history, real literature, but they saw those old stories as historical evidence, fragments of ancient culture that they needed to carefully preserve, almost like dinosaur fossils. And so off they went to start collecting stories. And this is where things get really interesting, because the stories they told everyone about how they collected these tales, well, that wasn't exactly true. Let's head into part 4. So, in their introduction to their early books, Jacob and Wilhelm painted a very specific, romantic picture about how they collected these stories. They pictured themselves as two dedicated scholars wandering the countryside, sitting by the fireside of some elderly, humble peasant woman, carefully writing down exactly all the ancient wisdom that had been passed down through generations. It's a beautiful image. It's also mostly made up, because in reality, they barely left home. In fact, they mostly just invited their own well-off, well-educated friends over for tea, and they basically had them retell stories from their past, from their own childhood. And their single biggest source of stories was a family who lived right across the street from them. They weren't poor, not rural, just a comfortable, educated, middle-class family, living a short walk away. Now, remember how I told you at the very start of the episode that one of their storytellers was going to become a big part of the family? Here it is. A young woman from that family across the street named Dorchen Wild gave the brothers some of their most famous tales, including Hansel and Gretel and Sleeping Beauty. And Wilhelm Grimm eventually married her. Let's say that again. The mysterious, ancient peasant woman from the introduction of the world-famous book was literally the girl next door, who became his actual wife. It's like telling everybody you found a secret family recipe from the remote mountain village, but actually it was like your neighbor just handed it to you over coffee one afternoon. And the story of Dorche is actually incredible in itself. See, her father was incredibly strict, and he actually forbade her from seeing the Grimm's brothers because, he considered them lower class. He considered them poor. But she did not listen at all. No. See, she snuck out in the middle of the night at around midnight with no shoes, crawling through the window at the Grimm's home, and she would sit for hours and tell these incredible, most fantastic stories that the world has ever seen, that the world has ever heard. And it doesn't just stop there. There was another storyteller that they love holding up as their ideal source, someone they even had painted looking humble and simple, like a folk legend itself. Except she actually grew up speaking fluent French. She wasn't even German at all. And she was likely just remembering stories that had been floating around the fancy French storytelling circles for hundreds of years. Probably first written down by some French author named Charles Perrault, who was a famous French author at the time. Which is a funny irony because if you think about it, they were trying to kind of preserve the German language, the German folklore, the German history. But instead, they accidentally proved the opposite, that stories actually travel across borders. The same basic tale, a poor woodcutter, a wicked witch, an underdog who wins in the end, shows up in cultures all over the world. So now they've got this pile of stories from friends, neighbors, and a future wife. What do they actually do with it? That's where things get even more interesting. Let's move on to part 5. See, the first version of their book came out in 1812, and here's a surprise. And this is something that I did not know when I was researching. That book actually flopped. I mean, it did not sell very well. It kind of read like a dense academic textbook. I mean, after all, they were scholars and academics. It was clunky writing, tons of footnotes, very kind of like raw, unedited, unpolished material. Basically a direct transcript of what people had told them. But over time, something shifted in the marketplace. A new middle class was suddenly growing across Europe, and parents wanted books that would teach their kids good lessons, good morals, and had good history behind them. And Wilhelm realized that if they actually wanted people to buy this thing, they needed to make it a whole lot nicer. So Wilhelm took on the lead on rewriting the whole thing, edition after edition. And in the process, he made one particular change that ended up shaping how millions of kids would experience these stories for the next 200 years. Here's what happened. In some of the earliest drafts, a few of the villains in these stories were actually the children's own mothers. I mean, sit with that for a second. Think about the version of the stories that we all kind of grew up with. The villain isn't a mother at all, is it? See, Wilhelm and Jacob eventually made a change, quietly, in a later edition, and that one small edit is the exact version that's been read to children ever since. They swapped the mothers out for stepmothers. They kept revising the book like this again and again, 7 editions later, from 1812 all the way to 1857, slowly turning a rough, scholarly, kind of academic transcript into the warm classic we know today. Now, at this point, you probably assume collecting, polishing these fairy tales was like the biggest achievement that these two brothers had in their entire lives. That's what they were working towards, right? In fact, that wasn't even close. And that's honestly the biggest twist in this whole story. Let's head into part 6. Here's the thing nobody expects. To Jacob and Wilhelm themselves, collecting those old German folklore stories, that was like a side project, a hobby. I mean, there was something else that they considered far more important. Alright, you ready for what this is? See, in 1819, Jacob published a massive study of German grammar. That's right. And he buried it inside a discovery that is genuinely mind-blowing. Something we now call the Grimm's Law. Here's a simple version of it. Jacob figured out that the consonants, sounds, they shift in predictable, almost mathematical way throughout language and throughout the evolution of language. And they split apart from each other over time. So for example, in Latin, the word for father is pater, with a hard P sound. The same ancient root shifted over centuries into the English word we now know as father, with an F sound. Now the same exact pattern with Latin words for fish. See, Pisces, which became our word for fish. And Jacob had figured out you could actually track and predict these sound shifts across entire language families. It's like solving a giant, centuries-long puzzle hidden inside everyday words. And being academic scholars, this is, I feel like, what they were born to do. I mean, this was their major quest in life. Think about that for a second. It's the exact same instinct that led them to collect the fairy tales in the first place. Just like they traced different versions of the same story back to shared roots, Jacob was tracing entire languages back to shared ancestors. And after that discovery, the brothers took on one final massive project, and they did it together. A gigantic dictionary attempting to document every single word in the German language. I mean, that is quite the undertaking. But for those two brothers who had gone through so much together and believed in each other so much, that's what they were meant to do. I mean, it was an absolutely enormous task. Reading thousands of old books and manuscripts, and they're writing it all down by hand. And here's where the story takes one last turn. Let's head into our final part, part 7. Jacob and Wilhelm worked on that giant dictionary right up until the end of their lives. Wilhelm unfortunately passed away in 1859, and Jacob just kept at it. He kept at it for 4 more years after that. And how far do you think two of the most brilliant language scholars that the world possibly has ever seen, up to that point, across their entire lifetimes, how far do you think they got working on that dictionary of every German word ever written? Unfortunately, not very far. Because by the time Jacob himself passed away in 1863, the two brothers had only made it to the letter F. And it gets even more specific than that. In fact, the very last word that they worked on was fruit. And other academic scholars actually carried the project after that. In fact, the project was completed in 1961, almost 100 years later. So two brothers who spent their entire lives obsessed with words quietly shaped the childhood of millions of kids around the world, and their own life's work literally stopped at the word fruit. There's something super poetic about that. And their fairy tale collection has actually been recognized and translated into more than 70 languages. And today, UNESCO actually recognized it as one of the most important works in human history. And it wasn't just the stories that they spread, it was the whole idea. In fact, collectors popped up all over the place after that. They were racing to write down local stories before they disappeared, directly inspired by what Jacob and Wilhelm did throughout their life and throughout Germany. So think back to how we started this episode, with the idea that these two brothers weren't totally honest about where their stories came from. Turns out that little lie is actually the most human part of this entire story. Two broke brothers sharing one bed to save on heat during the winter, grinding through books for 12 hours a day, studying old manuscripts, all while quietly, almost accidentally, cracking one of the biggest secrets in the history of language. So the next time you read one of these stories or watch a movie based on one, remember, you're not just hearing some ancient legend passed down through time. You're hearing the very specific, carefully polished voice of two brothers in a small town in Germany. Brothers who turned hard work, a few harmless lies, and a deep love of words into something that's lasted over 200 years. Thank you so much for joining me on this adventure in history. If you're watching this on YouTube, would you click on that like button and maybe consider subscribing if these are stories that you enjoy? It'll mean the world to me. I'll catch you next time.